At Hartman Innovations, no one notices the girl in the corner, quiet, black, 17 and invisible. While executives argue over a billion-dollar deal lost in translation, Ava Williams, daughter of the janitor, silently watches, until she speaks. And when she does, everything stops. Her voice, calm and fluent in a rare language, unravels what no one else could. But this isn't just about genius. It's about a world that only listens when power speaks. And what happens when a girl from nowhere teaches a billionaire how to truly hear? Stay with us, because this is a story where silence isn't. Weakness and brilliance doesn't ask for permission. Before we begin, tell us, have you ever been underestimated? In the heart of downtown Atlanta, on the 32nd floor of Hartman Innovations, chaos had a name: Ethan Hartman. The billionaire CEO stood at the head of the long conference table, flanked by panicked executives and overpaid consultants, all fumbling with a stack of documents printed in an unfamiliar script. Their latest partnership, a historic clean energy merger with Ethiopia's top sustainable tech firm, was hanging by a thread. The language barrier had proven catastrophic. The documents, critical legal texts in Amharic, arrived earlier than expected, and the translation team, outsourced by the company, had failed spectacularly. No one could read them. Not the Harvard-educated VP of strategy, not the multilingual CTO, not the assistant who claimed conversational Swahili. Ethan, who prided himself on dominance and control, was unraveling. "You had one job," he roared, slamming a binder shut. A junior manager tried to explain the confusion between Amharic and Arabic. Ethan cut him off mid-sentence. "I don't want apologies, I want results." One translator had already been fired before the meeting even began. Another had burst into tears. Around the room, no one dared speak, only shifting nervously in their seats, except for one girl in the back, almost invisible, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Ava Williams sat pressed against the wall, wedged between two IT interns who hadn't noticed her until now. Dressed in a plain grey shirt and black slacks, her company-issued badge clipped loosely to a lanyard, she looked like any other disposable temp brought in to run spreadsheets or fetch coffee. She wasn't meant to be in the meeting, not really. Her mother, Loretta, had insisted she take the assistant role for a few weeks while preparing to leave for Columbia University. "It'll keep you grounded," Loretta had said. But grounding didn't feel like this. Ava had tried to stay out of the way, taking notes no one would read, answering emails no one would send. But now, watching the room combust, a slow heat burned in her chest, not from anger or a panic, but something else. She knew what the script on the page was. She had spent months studying it, tracing the roots of Ge'ez, the base language, out of fascination. She had never planned to speak, never planned to be seen. But Ethan's rage kept building, tearing through layers of polished civility until it became embarrassing, almost pitiful. Then, in a voice that trembled at first but didn't break, Ava spoke. "I can try." Silence followed. Real silence, like someone had pressed pause on the entire floor. It was a mistake to speak. That was Ava's first thought after the words left. Her mouth, the reaction was immediate and merciless. Laughter cracked across the room like a whip. The legal counsel smirked. The marketing head chuckled openly. "The intern wants to play translator," someone murmured under their breath. Ethan turned slowly, arms crossed, eyebrows raised, mouth twisted in a crooked grin that could cut glass. He looked at Ava as if he were examining a beetle crawling up his shoe. "You," he said, dragging the word out, letting the disbelief hang in the air. "You speak Amharic?" Ava met his gaze, chin high. "I read it." The room wasn't used to defiance from her kind, young, black, and silent. Ethan scoffed and picked up the thickest stack of papers, flipping to a page filled with complex legal phrasing, stamps, and signatures. With the casual cruelty of someone used to mocking rather than mentoring, he tossed the papers toward her, letting them flutter to the ground near her feet. "Be my guest," his voice dripped with sarcasm. "Let's all take a break while our temp prodigy deciphers ancient scrolls." Ava bent to pick them up, her hand steady. The laughter continued but faded slightly, curiosity slipping through their amusement like water. Under a locked door, she didn't rush. She scanned the first page, tracing each line with her finger like she always did, aligning the structure in her mind. She didn't just recognize the language. She understood its rhythm, its nuance, the quiet weight of its legalese. "Clause 3.2, she began. Your voice, even and clear, pertains to post-merger intellectual property protections in Ethiopian jurisdiction. It states that failure to comply with domestic patent law by January 2025 will forfeit joint ownership of technological blueprints." The room fell still, dead still. Someone cleared their throat. Ava turned the page. Section 4 references transitional tax exemptions valid only if the U.S. partner maintains a registered green office in Addis Ababa by Q3. Now, nobody was laughing. Executives leaned forward, stunned. Her voice, once doubted, now rang with calm authority. She flipped another page, highlighting a clause that even the in-house legal team had missed. "Also," she said, "this paragraph implies that Hartman Innovations assumes 100% liability for currency conversion loss during the first fiscal year. That's financially suicidal." Ethan hadn't moved. He stood frozen by the window, staring at her like he was watching something unreal. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a comeback. He didn't know what to say. The girl he hadn't noticed all week, the one he couldn't name, wouldn't name, had just salvaged a deal worth $500 million. Not through charm, not through hierarchy, but through knowledge he didn't possess. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. Ava looked up from the final page, her voice soft. "Should I keep going?" A long moment passed. Ethan blinked, then slowly walked back toward the table. His steps, slower now, controlled. He looked at her with something closer to curiosity than contempt. "No," he said finally, quiet. "No, I think we've heard enough." But everyone else in the room wanted more, not just of her translation, of her. Ava Williams had just stepped out from the shadows, and not even the CEO could look away. No one knew what to do next. The hierarchy had ruptured in real time, in front of board members, executives and interns alike. Ava returned the pages to the table, stacked them neatly, and stepped back into silence, though it was no longer the same kind. She wasn't invisible anymore, not to them, and certainly not to Ethan. He watched her for a long second, then slowly turned toward the others, clearing his throat like a man who'd just swallowed something too large. "We'll reconvene at 2 p.m., he muttered. No one moved. The room was still processing what had just happened. Ava didn't wait for applause, validation, or recognition. She simply walked toward the exit with calm steps. But right before the door closed behind her, Ethan glanced at the papers again and muttered almost to himself, "Who the hell is she?" And for the first time, in a very long time, Ethan Hartman, the man who always had the answer, was left speechless. The silence that had once filled the room out of fear now returned, but this time it was different. This silence belonged to Ava. It was earned, claimed, respected, and it spoke louder than anything she could have said. Ethan Hartman noticed the absence before anyone else did. It was barely past 9 when he walked through the open floor, eyes flicking across desks, pausing instinctively where the girl had sat the day before. Empty. Her badge, gone. No note, no explanation. He stopped, unsure why it bothered him. "Where is the girl from yesterday?" he asked aloud, not facing anyone in particular. The interns froze. An assistant blinked. The senior project manager looked up from her laptop with confusion. "Which girl, Mr. Hartman?" someone asked cautiously. "The one who translated the documents." He turned, irritated now. "The one who saved your collective asses." Murmurs passed through the room like a current. "Oh, the intern," someone finally said. "I think she was just a temp. Nobody really knows her." Another voice chimed in, half laughing. "Pretty sure she's the janitor's daughter." Ethan's expression changed sharply. "That's not a name," he snapped. "What's her name?" Silence followed. Not one person could answer. They didn't know. She had been there for weeks, possibly months, and yet none of them had bothered to learn it. That fact, more than the laughter, more than the ignorance, stuck in Ethan's mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. He didn't respond to the murmuring crowd. Instead, he walked straight to the security desk, bypassing greetings and protocol. "I need access to yesterday's meeting footage," he said to the guard, who fumbled slightly at the tone. "Of course." "Mr. Hartman, I'll just pull the file." Within minutes, Ethan sat in front of a monitor in a side office. The door closed, the rest of the world shut out. He watched the recording from the moment he had thrown the documents toward her. He paused when Ava picked them up, zoomed in, rewound the moment her fingers touched the paper. He played it again, slower this time. Her lips moved with purpose, not hesitation. Her eyes scanned like someone who had seen the text before, not for its content, but for its shape, for its inner structure. She didn't just translate, she understood. He leaned back slightly, arms crossed, breathing uneven. He scrubbed back again to the moment right before she spoke. There it was, the second of indecision, of fear. The weight behind her, "I can try," hit him differently now. She hadn't just offered help, she'd offered herself up to humiliation and still stepped forward. Ethan's throat felt tight. It was rare for him to feel anything watching screens. But there she was, and he still didn't know her name. Outside the security office, Loretta Williams moved quickly down the corridor with a mop bucket, eyes low, head bent. She had almost passed the doctor when she heard her daughter's voice, faint but clear, coming from the monitor inside. Her steps faltered. She froze. She recognized the cadence instantly. Her heart squeezed. Her instinct was to walk away, not be seen. Ava had made her promise to never speak about their connection at work. "I want to be seen for who I am, not who you are," she had said. Loretta had understood. She knew what the world saw when it looked at her, a middle-aged black woman in a cleaning uniform. No one asked her name either. She pressed her back to the wall, breathing through her nose, trying to keep quiet. She listened as the footage played again, her daughter's voice echoing in the office like it belonged there. A quiet sob escaped before she could stop it. She covered her mouth with her hand. Her daughter had been brilliant, brave, extraordinary, and still no one had thought to ask her name. Loretta stood there in silence, watching a man who didn't know he was being watched, as he watched her daughter like she was a riddle he suddenly wanted to solve. Inside, Ethan sat motionless for a long while. When the footage ended, he replayed only her last words. "Should I keep going?" There was, something in the way she had said it. Not cocky, not meek, but sure, unapologetically sure. He opened the drawer of the desk where he kept a leather-bound notebook. It had remained blank since he received it as a gift 5 years ago. One of those executive tools consultants pushed on men like him to help them be more present. He had always scoffed at it, but now he flipped to the first page and picked up a pen. Slowly, he wrote the only thing he knew for certain, Ava Williams. He stared at the name for a while. She didn't feel like an intern. She wasn't a temp. He hated those labels. And now, she was something else entirely. Someone with substance, presence, weight, and yet completely unseen by everyone in the company, including him. Until now. Ethan left the security office in silence. He walked back into the hallway, only vaguely aware of the cleaning cart parked to the side, of the woman nearby wiping down a baseboard. His mind was elsewhere, but not far enough. When he glanced toward the mop bucket, something about the woman caught his eye. She wasn't looking at him. She didn't flinch like others did, but her eyes, red, tired, brave, told him she had heard everything. The connection sparked for just a moment, unspoken. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, but both knew that whatever line separated the floors of this building had just cracked. He walked away, back to his office, closing the door gently behind him. The notebook lay open on his desk. One name, written. Still, it felt like the first true note in a song just beginning. He picked up the pen again and wrote 2 more words beneath her name. Find her. The next day passed in a strange sort of quiet, as if something unspoken had settled across the upper floors of Hartman Innovations. Ethan sat in his office on the 5th floor, a level he rarely visited unless in transition between executive meetings. But today he wasn't moving. He was watching. Outside the tall window that overlooked the small courtyard below, his eyes tracked a lone figure sitting cross-legged on the edge of a concrete bench. It was Ava. She was tucked into herself, elbows resting on her thighs, completely absorbed in the pages of a worn paperback. He couldn't read the title from this height, but the script was unmistakable, Amharic. Her fingers traced the lines, sometimes lifting from the page as if she were outlining invisible grammar. She wasn't just reading, she was studying. He found himself leaning forward. There was something about the way she moved. Through the text so fluidly, so naturally, that made him hesitate. In the boardroom, she had stunned them all, himself included. But this quiet study, away from eyes, away from recognition, this felt more powerful. It wasn't a performance. It was who she was, and for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't interrupt. He just observed. He wasn't used to this version of himself. He had built an empire on speaking first, demanding answers, filling silence with certainty. But in the stillness of that moment, watching her, he realized how rarely he had watched anything, really watched. He had dismissed people by instinct, assessed, categorized, moved on. Ava defied categorization. She was 17, a temp, the daughter of a janitor, if what he'd overheard was true. And yet, she carried herself with a gravity that not one of his executives could fake. Ethan folded his arms and leaned his shoulder against the window. Part of him wanted to call down, say something clever, maybe even thank her. But the words stuck. They didn't feel right. He didn't want to diminish the weight of the scene by turning it into a transaction. This wasn't a deal. It wasn't a lesson. It was something quieter, slower. She didn't know he was watching. That mattered. Ava belonged to that moment in a way he never could. And so he stayed behind the glass, suspended in a humility he didn't quite know what to do with. Down in the courtyard, Ava turned a page, then paused. She looked up, instinctively, scanning the windows. When her eyes reached the 5th floor, she stopped. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, she held his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. But her posture shifted ever so slightly, the corners of her mouth tightening into something unreadable. Then slowly, she closed the book. Her fingers rested on the cover for a moment before she stood. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. She simply lowered her head and walked away, disappearing through the double doors at the base of the building. Ethan remained at the window, unmoving. He didn't know what she saw in his face, if it was curiosity, remorse, awe, or some mess of all 3, but he had no doubt she saw something. And whatever it was, it made her leave. The bench sat empty now, the silence around it louder than before. Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his mouth, as if trying to remove words he hadn't spoken. Later that night, long after the office had emptied out and only the janitorial staff moved through the corridors, Ethan returned to his office with something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He sat at his desk and opened the same leather notebook where, just the day before, he had written her name. He flipped to a blank page, hesitated, then began to write. Not a letter, not a command, just a message. Simple, quiet, honest. He thought of the way she had held that book, not like a student showing off, but like someone in love with knowledge. He thought of the way she had walked away without a word, her dignity intact. He wrote carefully, making sure each letter was neat. When he finished, he read it twice. Then, instead of emailing or texting, things he usually did without thought, he got up and walked down to the courtyard himself. The place was empty, the bench still cold. He slid the note between the pages of the book she had left behind, right where the bookmark rested. Then he left. The next morning, Ava found the note. She had returned early, before most of the building had stirred, expecting to reclaim the book she had forgotten in. AC. But as she flipped it open to the marked page, a small folded piece of paper slipped out. She caught it before it hit the ground, unfolding it slowly, suspiciously. The handwriting was sharp, almost surgical in precision, not what she expected. The message read, "You were brilliant. Can you teach me to understand what no one else does?" For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, despite herself, she smiled, the kind of smile she hadn't allowed in public spaces for a long time. It didn't feel like a trick. It didn't feel like a test. It felt like the first genuine question anyone at Hartman Innovations had ever asked her. She looked up, scanning the windows again. No one stared back. But somewhere she knew he was watching. And in two separate rooms, at two different heights, both Ava and Ethan smiled, for the first time in years. The invitation came mid-morning, slid across Ava's desk by a senior executive who didn't even make eye contact. "Mr. Hartman would like your assistance in reviewing documents for a pending negotiation with the Kyoto Green Infrastructure Group," he muttered before walking off. No explanation, no context. But Ava already knew what it was. Another test. Another moment Ethan was unsure how to approach directly. She tucked the note into her bag and didn't respond immediately. When she arrived on the top floor later that day, she stood at the edge of his open office door and waited. Ethan looked up from the conference table cluttered with contracts, laptops, and half-eaten power bars. "Thanks for coming," he said. But she didn't move. "Before I sit," Ava said quietly, "I need one thing clear." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his instinctive defensiveness flickering. "All right. If I help..." "You with this?" she continued. "You don't talk to me like you talk to them." She nodded toward the glass beyond the office, where VPs cowered, interns jumped, and assistants faked importance. "You mean like I talk to people I pay?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Ava didn't flinch. "No, no. In people you don't listen to." For a second he held her stare, then looked down. "Fair enough." They worked for hours, side by side, but not quite close. Ava sat at one end of the table, headphones around her neck, a legal pad in front of her. Ethan scrolled through projected clauses on the screen, occasionally glancing at her for cues. This was his world, deal-making, risk management, leverage, but today something felt unfamiliar. Every time he began a sentence with, "We need to," or, "Obviously this means," Ava raised a single finger, not rudely, but firmly. "Let me read first," she said. And he stopped. It was jarring. No one told Ethan Hartman to wait, but she did, again and again, and somehow it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like necessity. By mid-afternoon, Ava had restructured 4 of the key paragraphs, spotted 2 contradictions in the Japanese clauses, and caught a Translation slip that would have cost the company close to $9 million in long-term tax errors. Ethan hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. He just watched her mark up the documents, writing in precise bilingual notation, her mind operating at a level few people he'd met could match. And she never boasted, never paused to gloat. There was a quiet rhythm to her work, direct, exacting, almost reverent. At one point, Ethan tried to speak. "You know," he began, clearing his throat, "when I was younger, But Ava didn't look up. She simply replied, "This isn't about when you were younger. This is about what you're doing now." Her words weren't cruel, but they sliced through his reflex to dominate the narrative. He sat back in his chair, visibly recalibrating. He wasn't used to being disarmed so quickly, so precisely. She was still writing, flipping pages, highlighting margins in blue. "Do you always correct people like that?" he asked. She finally looked at him. "Only when they're about to confuse connection with performance." He didn't understand at first, and maybe he wasn't supposed to. It wasn't a game to her. This was her language, the language of boundaries, of earned space. Ethan found himself quiet again, not out of intimidation, but respect, real respect, the kind you didn't get from title or wealth, but from someone seeing you clearly and still choosing to engage. They continued working without another personal word, the silence between them not awkward, but charged, with a new kind of understanding. By the end of the day, the contracts had been fully reviewed, corrected, and reformatted. Ethan stood and stretched, his back sore from hours hunched over the table. Ava remained seated, organizing her notes. She didn't look tired, just thoughtful. "You could run this entire department," he said, more to himself than to her. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood, gathered her things, and pulled something wrapped in a soft cloth from her bag. She placed it on his desk, not forcefully, but deliberately, and looked at him one last time before heading toward the door. "Don't open it while I'm still here," she said. He watched her go, unsure why his throat suddenly felt tight again. Once the door clicked shut, he unfolded the cloth. Inside was a hand-bound dictionary, handwritten cover to cover. It wasn't a simple glossary. It was filled with notes. Explanations, metaphors, linguistic bridges, built from one culture to another. Each page had markings in Amharic, Japanese, English, and even fragments of Latin roots. His name was on the inside cover. But more striking than the pages was the post-it stuck to the front, written in neat cursive. "Words build, words break, choose." Ethan held the dictionary in his hands longer than he intended. He flipped through page after page, stunned by the care and complexity. This wasn't a gift. It was a lesson, one he didn't yet fully grasp. He walked slowly to the drawer he had long kept locked, the one filled with confidential memos, past regrets, NDA-covered confessions. He placed the dictionary inside, carefully, and closed it. For years, that drawer had been a place where things went to disappear, mistakes, secrets, errors. But now it held something else entirely. Not a secret, not a mistake, a mirror, a standard. He sat down again, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The silence in the room felt different now, not hollow, full, like it had a shape. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Hartman didn't need to speak to feel heard. Loretta Williams wasn't supposed to know. Ava had been careful, meticulous even, about keeping her presence on the 30th floor discreet. She used service elevators, came in early, left late. She never bragged, never mentioned her meetings with Ethan Hartman or the translation work she was now quietly known for among top brass. But secrets, even the well-kept ones, slip through cracks. Loretta found out from a conversation she overheard between two maintenance staff, whispering in disbelief, "Your daughter was in Hartman's office again? Girls going places." Loretta froze mid-sweep. Her hand tightening on the mop. Fear rose in her like a tide. This wasn't the plan. Ava wasn't supposed to be seen, not in that way, not in his space. That floor wasn't safe. It was filled with men who smiled with clipped mouths and praised just loud enough for others to hear. Loretta had cleaned that floor for 8 years. She had scrubbed the marble halls that made other people feel important. She had seen enough to know what could happen to a girl like Ava in a place like that. She didn't wait for a break or approval. She took off her gloves and marched toward the executive wing with her ID. Badge clipped firmly to her chest. When she stepped into Ethan's office, he didn't look up at first. He was on a call, scribbling notes, barely registering the presence at his door. "Give me a sec," he said, distracted. But Loretta didn't wait. "No, Mr. Hartman," she said firmly. "You'll give me a minute now." That made him stop. He looked up slowly, brows furrowed as if trying to place her. For a split second he almost asked who she was. But he didn't. Something in her eyes, not anger, but authority, forced recognition. "You're her mother," he said quietly. Loretta nodded. "I'm the one. Oh, who's been cleaning your mess for 8 years. Her tone wasn't bitter, it was measured, focused. "I know what goes on up here. And I know people like you. You see something rare and want to put your name on it, like it's yours to discover." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I never—" She cut him off. "My daughter doesn't need your approval. She doesn't need your charity. And she sure as hell doesn't need to be paraded around like some office mascot because she speaks languages better than the men twice her age." Ethan sat back slowly, stunned not by her volume, but by the clarity of her words. She didn't flinch. She didn't stutter. There was nothing submissive in her posture, only a mother standing between her daughter and a history she refused to repeat. "She was accepted to Columbia," Loretta added, voice shaking now, not from fear, but emotion. "Full ride. Honors program. She never told. You, did she? Because she thought if people here found out, they'd find a way to ruin it, sabotage it, keep her just useful enough not to leave." Ethan looked down at his desk, suddenly uncomfortable with the wealth of documents and decisions in front of him. It felt hollow. He didn't respond, but she wasn't done. You see, she's been hiding who she is to survive in a place that wouldn't know what to do with her if they really knew. She's been shrinking herself to fit inside your structure, and now you want her to shine for you. Loretta shook her head. "She's already brilliant. She doesn't need your light. She is her own." Ethan looked up, speechless. For the first time in years, Ethan Hartman, the man whose name dictated mergers, whose calls rerouted entire departments, didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. He had expected resistance from board members, pushback from clients, but not this. Not truth served without theatrics, just straight, burning honesty. "I didn't know," he said finally. "No," Loretta replied. "You didn't care enough to ask." That line hit deeper than she realized. He swallowed hard. This woman had walked his halls for nearly a decade, cleaning up after people who wouldn't say her name. He had probably passed her dozens of times, never once registering her humanity. She had been furniture, background. Now she stood before him like a mirror he hadn't asked for, but couldn't look away from. Loretta sighed, softening. "I'm not here to start something. I'm here to end it. Let my daughter walk her own path. Don't twist it to fit your idea of mentorship or redemption." She turned to leave. "And don't ever call what she is a surprise. She's not a surprise. She's the result of work you've never had to do." That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay on his back in a bed that usually felt like a fortress, but now felt exposed. His mind replayed Loretta's voice, her face, her words. He thought of the 8 years she had worked for his company, how she'd been invisible in plain sight, like so many others. It struck him how easily he'd accepted the hierarchy that made someone like her disappear. He couldn't remember ever seeing her in the employee directory, couldn't remember offering her a holiday bonus, couldn't remember a single word exchanged in passing. And yet, she had been watching, listening, raising brilliance in silence, raising Ava. He thought of Ava hiding her Columbia acceptance, of the fear she must have carried. It burned at him. He had always thought shame belonged to failure, to loss. But this was different. He had been successful and still small. He had held power and used it carelessly. For the first time in his adult life, he felt ashamed, not of what he had done, but of what he hadn't seen. As dawn broke, Ethan sat in his office alone, watching the sky lighten through the glass. He opened the drawer where Ava's handwritten dictionary now rested. He didn't take it out. He just touched the cover, running his thumb along the spine. He didn't deserve her brilliance, and he knew now that it hadn't come from nowhere. It came from a woman who mopped his floors in silence and raised a daughter with the kind of resilience that couldn't be taught in boardrooms. He closed the drawer slowly, sat back in his chair, and stared out the window. For the first time, Ethan Hartman felt something beyond discomfort, beyond guilt. He felt shame, quiet, deep, and deserved. When Ava received the handwritten note, she wasn't sure what to make of it. "Come by my office at 3. No contracts, just coffee. E.H." She stared at it for a while, uncertain if it was a trap, a performance, or something more complicated. But curiosity got the better of her. At 3 o'clock sharp, she stood in front of Ethan Hartman's office door, hesitated only a second, then stepped inside. He was already there, not behind the desk this time, but seated at a small round table near the wall, with 2 mugs steaming and something spread across the surface. A jigsaw puzzle, its pieces, scattered like tiny, undeciphered notes. Ava blinked. "A puzzle?" she asked, arching a brow. Ethan gave a lopsided shrug. "Could have offered you another language contract, but I figured we both needed something less weaponized." His attempt at humor was awkward, but honest. Ava didn't laugh, but she didn't leave either. She moved toward the table and sat down, choosing a corner piece without a word. The silence between them stretched for long minutes, not hostile, just fragile. They sipped, sorted, and slowly began placing pieces. For once, nothing was being asked of her mind. It was just there, present, unguarded. Ava was the first to speak, gently nudging a sky-blue piece into place. "My dad used to do this with me, puzzles, when I was a kid." She didn't look at Ethan as she said it. Her fingers kept working, flipping pieces, checking edges. He said it was the best way to learn patterns, that you had to learn to see what wasn't there before you could understand what was. Her voice carried a rhythm that suggested she hadn't said those words aloud in a long time. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, finding an edge piece himself and pressing it into place. "Where is he?" "Now?" he asked quietly. Ava paused, eyes flicking to the side. "Gone. Cancer. I was 13. The words didn't carry drama. They were facts she had learned to live around. Ethan nodded again, slower this time. "My mom died when I was 12. It came out more abruptly than he intended." Ava looked up. He didn't usually volunteer information. "How?" she asked. "Car accident," he replied. "Middle of the night. She was driving home from a second job. My dad blamed the hours. I blamed the system. Then I decided feelings didn't solve anything, so I built a life that didn't need them." His voice cracked at the end, just slightly. They didn't speak for a while after that. The puzzle filled the space between them, absorbing the emotions they weren't yet ready to name. Ava traced a few corner pieces with her finger, thinking about her father's laugh, the way he used to tap the table twice when he found a piece that fit. "He used to say puzzles were metaphors," she murmured. Ethan looked up. "For what?" She gave a small, dry smile. "For everything. Language, family, grief, that we're all just trying to make something whole out of broken shapes that don't come with instructions. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting that settle. "Smart man," he said. Ava nodded. "He was. That's why I kept learning after he died. Made it feel like he wasn't entirely gone." Ethan stared at her, struck by how simply she carried that kind of grief. Not as a performance, but as part of her structure. She wasn't speaking to impress or gain favor. She was just sharing. No walls, no manipulation, just raw, lived experience. Eventually, Ethan shifted in his chair, folding his hands together. "You know, I used to think silence was something to conquer. That if I just filled every moment with plans, commands, data, I'd be safe. No surprises, no emotions." He looked down at the table. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe silence isn't empty. Maybe it's where the real stuff hides." Ava's lips parted, almost in surprise. "My dad used to say that too. Not in those words, but close." "Enough!" She tilted her head, studying him for a beat longer than usual. So, what changed?" Ethan considered the question, then answered honestly. "You and your mother." He let the words sit in the air. "You both spoke when no one else would. You both told me the truth, and I didn't like it, but I heard it." Ava didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for a corner of the puzzle where the pieces were still scattered. "Truth only works if someone's willing to stop defending the lie," she said, almost absently. Ethan absorbed that like a blow and a gift in one. By the time the puzzle was halfway complete, their conversation had shifted into something even rarer, stillness that wasn't uncomfortable. Ava didn't feel watched or measured, and Ethan didn't feel the need to control or impress. They shared stories, fragments of childhoods, glimpses of losses, names of people they loved, but no longer had. There were pauses, but none of them felt like gaps. They were simply pauses. Ava noticed how Ethan didn't interrupt, how he let her words hang, even when they hurt. She realized that for the first time in their interactions, they hadn't spoken once about business, power, or success. There were no agendas, no strategic motives, just two people shaped by loss, trying to assemble a picture neither had the full image for. And maybe that was the point, that no one ever did. Ava found herself smiling once, softly at a memory. Ethan saw it but didn't comment. He just smiled too, not because he was trying to relate, but because the smile itself was enough. When they finally reached the last few pieces, Ava slid one into the center of the image, a missing part that brought the entire frame together. She leaned back, stretched her arms, and exhaled. "Looks like we made something," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. "We did." He didn't mean the puzzle, and she knew that. As Ava stood to leave, Ethan didn't stop her. He didn't offer another task, didn't mention future plans or job titles. She walked to the door, pausing for just a second. "This was the first time I didn't feel like I had to prove anything," she said. He looked at her, something raw in his eyes. "Same." The door clicked behind her, leaving him alone with a half-finished mug and a completed picture. For the first time, the silence in his office wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. It was a Thursday afternoon, when Ava returned from the break room to find something unusual tucked into the narrow cubby where she kept her books and notebook. A plain white envelope. No name, no stamp, no indication of who had placed it there. Her heart picked up pace as she pulled it free, instinctively checking both ends of the hallway to see if anyone had lingered nearby. No one. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was something she hadn't expected to see again. A second official letter from Columbia University, identical in format to the one she had received months earlier. But this one came with additional documents, a housing assignment in a dormitory near the linguistics department, a printed itinerary with a one-way plane ticket to New York City, dated for the following week. Enclosed with it, a prepaid debit card under her name, enough to cover initial living costs. And then, at the very bottom, a small cream-colored note card with no logo or signature, just 3 handwritten words in a script she recognized instantly. Fly without fear. Her knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the shelf, stunned by the message's weight and the anonymity that made it even more powerful. For a long moment she just stood there, the envelope pressed against her chest like a shield. The words echoed inside her louder than any applause could have. She knew, of course, who had done it. There was only one person who would have had both the resources and the discretion to make this happen, and who would choose, deliberately, not to sign his name. It was his way. Ava could almost hear his voice saying, "Don't thank me. Just use it." Her eyes welled up. She hadn't cried in years, not for herself, not since her father passed. But this wasn't just about generosity. This was about belief. Someone had looked at her, not through the lens of obligation or charity, but with recognition. And that kind of faith in her future cracked something open inside her. She clutched the envelope, the card still trembling in her fingers, and walked with quickening steps to the elevator. She didn't think. She just needed to see her mother, needed to feel something real. The doors opened. She stepped inside. Loretta was in the back corridor folding towels when Ava burst in. At first she thought something had gone wrong. Ava's shoulders were shaking, her eyes wet. But then Ava fell into her arms without a word, holding tight, sobbing without shame. It wasn't dramatic. It was overdue. Loretta froze, overwhelmed, then wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her like she hadn't since she was a child. "Baby, what is it?" She whispered, brushing a hand over Ava's hair. Ava couldn't speak at first. She just handed her the envelope. Loretta read silently, her eyes scanning the papers, the card, the 3 words. Her hand trembled as she passed them back. She didn't ask who sent it. She already knew. "He knows," she said, quietly, almost reverently. Ava nodded, tears still streaming. Loretta pulled her close again, resting her chin on her daughter's head. "You've earned every word of that letter," she murmured. "You built this, not him. But maybe he just opened the last door." They stood there for a long time. Mother and daughter, no longer hiding in corridors or behind uniforms, just 2 women finally seen. Later that evening, after everyone else had gone home and the building had fallen into its late shift stillness, Ava walked slowly toward the top floor. The envelope was gone now, tucked safely in her bag, but in her hand she carried something smaller, a note of her own. She had rewritten it 3 times before settling on the right words. There was no envelope, no flourish, just a square of paper folded once. When she entered Ethan's office, it was empty. He had left early, or perhaps just chosen to give her the space to do this on her own terms. She stepped up to his desk and placed the note dead center, aligned with the edge. No signature, just one message, in her own handwriting, deliberate and clean. "What you saw in me, see in others." She stared at it for a few seconds, then turned and left. There was nothing more to say. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was a challenge, a reminder, a seed. That night, Ethan returned to his office later than usual. He didn't expect to find anything, but when he saw the folded square, his breath caught. He sat down, unfolded it, and read the line again and again. "What you saw in me, see in others." He set the paper down beside Ava's hand-bound dictionary and leaned back in his chair. The message wasn't praise, it was purpose, a directive. He understood that now. She didn't want to be exceptional. She wanted to be the start of something, a shift, a pattern worth repeating. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not unpleasant, but heavy with responsibility. It was so easy to applaud one gifted person, to make a story out of a singular exception. Much harder and more necessary to change the way you looked at everyone else. Back in her small room, Ava sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the open Columbia packet beside her. It didn't feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a continuation, like her voice had finally reached beyond the rooms she'd always been kept out of. Loretta came in carrying a mug of tea and sat beside her without a word. Ava leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, quiet now. For the first time, the future didn't seem like a cliff. It felt like a runway, and in the stillness between them, both women knew something irreversible had happened. She was going. She was ready. She was not afraid. When the announcement was made, most people at Hartman Innovations thought it was a PR stunt, a new initiative buried halfway through an internal email. We are launching the Hartman Fellowship Program, designed to support the higher education of children of our maintenance, security, and cafeteria staff. The message was signed by Ethan himself. It landed with a soft thud in most inboxes, until people began to realize it wasn't a placeholder or a publicity move. It was real. A full tuition scholarship program backed by corporate funds with dedicated application support and guaranteed internship tracks. The silence that followed in the executive floors wasn't confusion, it was disbelief. No one had seen Ethan Hartman as a man who shared. He conquered, led, predicted. But now he was choosing to invest, not in stocks, but in people no one at the top had ever spoken, unless something had gone wrong. When his VP of Finance raised concerns about sustainability and optics, Ethan stared at him for 3 full seconds and then asked, "Would you prefer we sustain a system that only feeds people who already eat?" The VP laughed. A mistake. He was fired by noon. The ripple was immediate. 2 other executives chuckled under their breath during the first inclusion meeting, where Ethan presented the outline for a new department, not HR-run, not outsourced, a fully funded cultural inclusion and equity division with direct reporting access to the CEO. Ethan paused mid-sentence when the second laugh escaped, looked at both men, and said plainly, "You're dismissed, effective now." Security escorted them out before the room had a chance to breathe. That afternoon, the empty seats were filled by 2 young professionals who had grown up on Atlanta's South Side, both referred by Ava. They didn't wear suits, they didn't quote industry journals, but when they spoke, the room listened. One of them, a first-gen college graduate named Malik, had spent his teen years coding apps for local schools. The other, Jamila, was a sociolinguist who had written about dialect discrimination in American education systems. Ethan gave them titles and budgets before the end of the day. The next morning, someone on the operations team asked if there had been a mistake in the org chart. "No," Ethan replied. "There's been a correction." Ava watched the changes. From the sidelines at first, uncertain if the momentum would last. But day by day, the signs multiplied. The cafeteria menu changed to accommodate cultural traditions that had never been acknowledged. Signs were posted in Spanish, Amharic, and Vietnamese, not as decoration, but for clarity. Employees began seeing HR forms translated accurately. Training workshops included modules on unconscious bias and institutional privilege, written by Jamila herself. Ava smiled when she saw Malik holding court in a break room, showing 3 engineers how to write a script that translated informal dialects into business standard phrasing, not to erase identity, but to build bridges. It was radical, but it didn't scream revolution. It moved like language does, softly, insistently, reshaping the air. Ethan wasn't the face of it. He didn't give speeches. He showed up to the meetings, listened, and when needed, stepped back. The power had started to redistribute, not by accident but by design. Still, resistance lingered. In one closed-door conversation, a senior consultant tried to warn Ethan that the company's culture was being disrupted too quickly. Ethan sat with that word for a moment, then asked, "You mean the culture where 30% of our staff uses back elevators because they don't want to be seen by the execs?" The man faltered. "That's not what I meant." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's the problem. You never mean it, but it happens anyway." There were no raised voices, no slamming of doors, just a quiet final email the next day. The consultant's name no longer appeared in the directory. Ethan no longer tolerated performative compliance. He was no longer trying to manage discomfort. He was undoing the conditions that made it necessary in the first place. He had stopped chasing innovation in products. He was chasing it in people, in structures, in silence that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Ava, for her part, began mentoring 3 interns from the new hiring wave. They didn't come from Ivy League schools. They came from community programs, city scholarships, GED completion courses, and they were brilliant in ways the system didn't test for. She worked with them in quiet corners of the building, revisiting the puzzle metaphors her father once used. "Every piece has a place," she'd say, "even the ones the box forgets to highlight." She didn't use Ethan's name when she told them how she got here. She didn't need to. They could see the shift in the company, like light entering a room that had always been dim. Loretta still cleaned the upper floors, by choice now, and sometimes during breaks she sat beside Ava and watched the interns laugh, stumble, and rise. "Feels different now," she whispered one day. Ava nodded. "Because it is." For the first time, the corridors of Hartman Innovations didn't hum with sameness. They carried the weight of new voices, laughing in accents, pausing between dialects, asking unfiltered questions. The company's walls had once reflected only power and polish. Now they reflected possibility. There were still gaps, still pushbacks, still work to do. But something irreversible had begun. The change wasn't about diversity reports or inclusion goals. It was in the way people looked at each other, no longer down, no longer past. Ethan walked those halls too, sometimes with Malik, sometimes alone. And when he passed people he used to ignore, he nodded. Not out of politeness, but because, finally, he saw them. The elevator ride to the rooftop wasn't long, but for Ava, it felt like a pause stretched between 2 lives. She'd taken that elevator many times, mostly in silence, mostly alone. But this time, Ethan was beside her, holding 2 paper cups of hibiscus tea in his hands, careful not to spill. "I figured you'd prefer this over coffee," he said with a quiet smile. Ava looked at him, her eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. "You remembered." He didn't answer, just offered her one of the cups as the doors opened. The rooftop wasn't lavish or scenic. It was simple, a flat, open space with an old wooden bench near the edge and the Atlanta skyline in full view. She stepped forward slowly, sipping her tea, letting the wind settle around her. Ethan followed behind, but didn't speak. There was nothing urgent about this moment. It didn't feel like a meeting or a gesture. It felt intentional. They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward, not tense, just a stillness that came when words had done their work. Then, without theatrics, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her an envelope. Ava didn't open it at first. She looked at him, eyebrows raised again. He motioned gently. "Just." It read. Inside was a letter printed on company letterhead, with her name at the top and a job title beneath it. Cultural Consultant, Hartman Innovations. The contract outlined flexible hours, remote collaboration, and full autonomy over projects, all designed to accommodate her academic schedule. At Columbia, "I want the bridge you built to stay strong," he said, his voice steady. "And I know no one can see things the way you do." Ava read it carefully, the pages trembling slightly in her hands. Then she folded them and returned them to the envelope. "I'm honored," she said, and she meant it, but not now. Ethan tilted his head. "Why?" She looked at him, her voice calm but firm. "Because I need to build something without your shadow, without this company's name behind me. I need to find out who I am away from here, away from you." The words weren't cruel. They were exact, measured. She owed him honesty, and she gave it. Ethan nodded once, slowly, no resentment in his face. "That's fair." There was a pause before he reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out something thicker, a worn, leather-bound notebook. Ava's breath caught when she saw it. "Is that—" "Yes." He interrupted. "The one I never used until the day you translated Amharic like it was your first language." He handed it to her, and she opened it slowly, flipping through pages now filled with notes, reflections, and messy underlines. Observations from meetings, questions about language and leadership, fragments of quotes, Ava's name circled and recircled in different corners. On one page it simply said, "What does it mean to listen?" And beneath that, in newer ink, "Ask Ava." She didn't speak for a long moment. Her fingers ran over the paper, over the edges softened by time and touch. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked, not because she didn't understand, but because she needed to hear it. Ethan looked at her with none of the pride he once wore like armor. Only humility. "Because you taught me what none of my mentors did, and I don't want it to end here. If you ever want to keep teaching me, this is my way of asking." Ava held the notebook to her chest. It felt heavier than its pages. She thought of the first day they met, of the laughter, the disbelief, the moment he threw the documents at her in jest. And now this, not a gift, a symbol, a question. She looked at him and smiled, not wide, not performative, just enough to say, "I hear you." "Maybe one day," she said softly. "But not yet." He nodded again. "Then I'll wait." There was nothing else to negotiate. No promises made, just the simple understanding that something had changed, something that didn't need labels or roles to prove it existed. Ava stood slowly, tucking the notebook under her arm. The skyline behind her shimmered in the late afternoon light. Ethan remained seated, watching her as if trying to memorize a moment he knew he wouldn't get again soon. She didn't say goodbye when she walked toward the elevator. She didn't need to. He didn't call after her either. There were no dramatic final words, no declarations of what this meant. That wasn't their style anymore. Ava reached the elevator, pressed the button, and turned for one last look. Ethan was still on the bench, holding his cup of hibiscus tea, staring straight ahead. She gave him a small nod, one he returned without hesitation. The elevator dinged. She stepped inside, and just like that, she left the rooftop, left the building, left the chapter, but not the impact, not the bridge they had built. As the doors closed and the elevator carried her downward, Ava pressed the notebook tightly against her chest, her mind quiet but steady. It wasn't fear that filled her now, it was clarity. The next chapter wouldn't be written in a high-rise office or inside the safety of someone else's belief. It would be hers, entirely. And as the elevator reached the ground floor, Ava Williams stepped out, not as someone leaving something behind, but as someone walking fully into herself. 5 years had passed, but walking through the glass doors of Hartman Innovations still made Ava's chest tighten. Not with fear, not even with nostalgia, but with a strange sense of reclaimed space. The security staff recognized her now, not just from articles or conference bios, but from the legacy she had left behind, quietly, intentionally. She was no longer the daughter of the janitor or the intern who translated Amharic. She was Dr. Ava Williams, soon-to-be published author, keynote linguist, and global consultant. Today, she'd returned as the closing speaker of the International Dialogue and Diversity Summit, hosted by the very company that once barely knew her name. As she stood before hundreds in the atrium, speaking fluently in 7 languages, switching from Swahili to French to Amharic without pause, she didn't need slides or titles to command attention. She was the message. When the final applause died down, Ava stepped down from the stage with calm precision, pausing only to shake hands with the interpreter she had trained 2 years earlier. The event was over. The speeches delivered. But one part of her journey remained unfinished. And only one. Room in the building could offer what she needed. She walked slowly, turning left down the service hallway that connected the conference wing to the original structure. The executive suite was behind her now. This direction led not to boardrooms or auditoriums, but to the narrow corridor where her mother, Loretta Williams, had spent over a decade pushing a cart no one looked at, mopping floors that sparkled while people passed by without thanks. Ava's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she reached the place where the janitor's storage closet used to be, now renovated into a reflective space called the ground floor gallery. On the far wall, mounted in bronze against textured stone, was a plaque that caught the light from above. She stepped closer, breath catching in her throat. The engraving read, "In living memory of Loretta Williams, because greatness begins where." No one dares to look. Ava reached out, fingertips grazing the name. There were no tears this time, just a full heart. Just recognition, the kind that had been denied for too long. She whispered softly, "We're still here, Mama. Look at us now." Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Softly, respectfully, she turned. Ethan Hartman stood by the pillar near the edge of the gallery, hair now more silver than black, suit a little looser on his frame. His hands were clasped in front of him, a silent smile on his face. For a second, they didn't move. Time folded between them. Then Ava crossed the distance, not walking, running, not hesitant, certain. And when she reached him, she fell into his arms the way she had once fallen into her mother's. Ethan embraced her fully, without words, without ceremony. It was not the hug of a boss or a mentor. It was something older, a long exhale between 2 people who had built a bridge the world once said couldn't exist. "I'm proud of you," he murmured finally, voice hoarse. She nodded into his shoulder, whispering, she would be too. They stayed that way a long moment. No cameras, no applause, just silence, sacred and healing. When they pulled apart, Ava gestured toward the plaque. She never asked for any of this, and now she's part of everything. Ethan nodded, eyes damp. She is the reason for everything. He pointed slightly downward. Ava followed his gaze. Just beneath Loretta's name, in smaller type, was another engraving, one she hadn't seen before. Ava Williams, the one who taught the giant how to speak to the world. Ava's lips parted. Her hand flew to her mouth, stunned into stillness. She blinked once, then again. Her name, carved not as a footnote, but as a lesson, a legacy. She turned to Ethan, speechless for once. "You didn't have to." He shook his head gently. "No," he said, "but I had to." And that was enough. Ava stood for a while longer in front of the wall, reading both names again and again. Her mother's story had once lived in silence, but now it echoed in bronze and memory, in turns walking those halls with purpose, in languages spoken freely in meetings once dominated by uniformity. And hers was no longer a whisper trying to be heard. It was part of the structure now, part of the blueprint. The company that once ignored her had been reshaped by her presence. She didn't stay long after that. There was a train to catch, a class to guest lecture, and a book release approaching. But before she left, she walked out through the main lobby, head high, notebook tucked under her arm, and a folded program in hand. As the automatic doors slid open, Ava looked back one last time at the building that had once towered above her like a wall. Now it felt different. It didn't shrink her anymore. It held her name and her mother's in places no one could erase. A place that was no longer built to exclude, but rebuilt to welcome. She smiled, then stepped forward. The sunlight, not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as someone who had claimed her space and left the door wide open behind her. The place wasn't just hers, it was theirs. What part of this story touched you the most? We'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Here on Your Channel Name, every story is crafted with deep care and dedication, not just by us, but with you in mind. When you subscribe to our channel, you're helping us continue to bring more meaningful, heartfelt stories like this one to life. So if this video resonated with you, please consider subscribing, giving it a like, and exploring the other stories we've shared. Your support means more than you know. Thank you for being here. We hope to see you again soon.